Hey guys, long time no see. Oh my god. Anyways, let's not talk about that right now. Hey, I'm back, and you probably saw this video and were like, okay, what is bro gonna yap about now? Sound native. Okay, so I guess he's literally insane. Yeah, I know it's been forever, hopefully you didn't forget who I am. But I'm back now, and I have this sick new model thanks to a wonderful artist named May. Let me know what you think in the comments. So I already know what you're thinking, you're like, bro, you can't just go and say sound native as if like anybody can just go and do that. That's like literally insane. Yeah, even I know that might make me sound like a snake oil salesman, especially with the history the Japanese learning community has. But to be honest, I think getting most of the way there is a lot easier than you think it is. Yeah, getting a literal perfect sounding 100% native accent that has not even the slightest mistake is borderline impossible, but you can get really close. And to be honest, it's less about talent and more about the things that you do and what you prioritize when learning Japanese that's really going to determine how good you sound. I actually think that for basically anyone, having a super good accent is really obtainable, but the problem is that there's just so much misinformation about good language learning techniques out there, and a lot of it really just hurts more than it helps. じゃあそれでは、どうやったらよりネイティブっぽく日本語を話せるようになるのかって皆さんに伝えたいと思います。まずはですね、ちょっと言っときたいことがあるんですけど、まあなかなかいい発音で話せるとはいえ、やっぱりネイティブじゃないので、ネイティブっぽくないところとか、その間違ってるところ絶対あると思いますけど、ゲームとかでよく、ちょっと待って、日本人じゃないのとか、発音が上手すぎてアメリカ人じゃないでしょとかって言われるので、まあ発音はそこそこいい方じゃないかって思います。なので、この動画ではどうやって発音をよくできるのかとか、発音に関するコツを紹介していきます。ぜひ最後まで見てください。So before I really get into anything, I just want to mention that this video is specifically for people who want to have as good of an accent as possible, so keep that in mind before you comment, bro, doesn't that literally contradict what you said in your other videos? If minimizing your accent is a specific goal that you have, the things you're going to want to focus on are somewhat different than if you plan on doing a more moderate approach. So in the first half of the video, I'm going to talk more about abstract concepts and general principles you should follow in order to get a good accent. In the second half, I'm going to talk more concretely about some good pronunciation rules you can learn and go over some ways that you can do more targeted work towards your accent. So to be honest, a lot of this stuff I already covered in my video about speaking, so you might feel like you've already heard some of this stuff before, but I wanted to make this video an all-encompassing guide specifically about accent. If you want to skip to the part where I specifically talk about accent rules and Japanese sounds, then you can skip to this timestamp. So I have studied a lot of this stuff in college and I have a degree in linguistics, but honestly, if I try to explain everything super thoroughly with linguistic lingo and stuff, then most of the people watching this are not going to understand. So for that reason, if you're looking for super in-depth analysis and linguistic explanations for stuff, I'm not really going to go over that here. My goal here is to make this stuff as digestible as possible for the average person learning Japanese so they don't have to learn all of this stupid linguistic stuff. Now, I know some people are going to be like, okay, but what's wrong with having an accent? Doesn't everybody have an accent? And honestly, that's a fair question. The short answer is that no, there's not really anything wrong with having an accent, and if trying to sound similar to natives isn't one of your goals, then that's completely fine. There are a few reasons why I do think having a good accent is beneficial though. The main reason being that unlike English, which has a ton of different international dialects and not a particular one that's recognized as the correct one, Japan is really homogenous and pretty much only Japanese people speak Japanese. If you have an accent in English, it's not necessarily thought of as being wrong, and unless your accent's really bad, people aren't really going to make assumptions about your level or infer that you can't speak the language well, but this isn't the case for Japanese. Yeah, there are dialects in Japanese that change the way people pronounce words, but it's usually pretty easy to tell if someone's foreign. If you have a really strong foreign accent in Japanese, then it really kind of just gives off the vibe that you don't actually know how to speak Japanese very well, even if that's not the case. If you don't want to play this game of the other person being like, oh, how much does he understand? Does he actually know Japanese? Am I able to say this word and he'll understand me? Then having a good accent in Japanese is a really easy way to convey that, actually, no, I do know this language. Also, people will just have a generally easier time understanding you. And to be honest, like on the down low, it's just really cool. Anyways, I digress. So the first thing I want to go over is some stuff about mindset and how it relates to accent. And you might think, bro, what the hell does mindset have to do with producing physical sounds? But trust me, it's important. In order to have a good accent, you need to actually care about having a good accent. I mean, it sounds sort of stupid when you phrase it like that because it's like, well, duh. But what I mean is that if you don't feel a strong drive to constantly improve how you sound, you probably are going to plateau at a certain point. I know just saying, lol, just want it more, sounds kind of pretentious, but hold on. So ultimately what I want to talk about is identity and how it really affects what results you're going to have when learning a language, and this isn't even just specific to having a good accent. You've probably heard of this book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a super famous book, and in the book, one of the things he talks about is that rather than becoming the person you want to be first, then having your identity change to match that, you first want to change your identity, then if you can do that, your habits are going to start to match that identity. It's sort of completely opposite to the way most people would intuit it. It's sort of like saying, okay, I'm going to hit the gym and become a healthy person. But if you don't have the identity of being a healthy person, you're more likely to be like, well, I'm not going to go to the gym today. Instead, what you should do is from the start say, I'm a healthy person. And even if you're not at your final goal yet, because you identify with being a healthy person, you're more likely to do habits that are going to make you healthier. So we're basically just taking this entire concept and applying it to Japanese. So you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, bro, just let me change my identity to, let's see, literally Japanese. Yeah, bro, I don't think that's going to fly. Okay, obviously that's not possible, but what you can do is stop thinking of yourself as a learner of Japanese and start identifying as a user of the Japanese language. You're also probably thinking, yeah, bro, sorry, but like, I just started this thing like 3 months ago, there's no way I can do that. Which, yeah, makes sense. So when I say user of the Japanese language, I don't necessarily mean user as in someone who speaks the language constantly. Using a language doesn't strictly have to mean speaking it. It can also mean someone who uses it to take in information and just do things normally in their life. Really, it's the small things that you do that are going to add up and really push this identity change. Stuff like changing your phone to Japanese, watching only Japanese news, subscribing only to Japanese YouTubers, except me, of course, are all things you can do to sort of push this identity change on yourself. I know that saying, yeah, just avoid English as much as possible sounds sort of extreme, and to be honest, it kind of is. But it's not necessarily just avoid English, it's more of just choose to do things in Japanese. You basically want to make Japanese the default option when you choose to do basically anything. Within reason, of course. You don't have to say konnichiwa to your family or something. This is one of the things that I like most about AJAT, all Japanese all the time, because it essentially tells you to make Japanese your second native language. And if you can convince yourself that Japanese is just a language that you use in your life for normal things, you won't have to force habits upon yourself because you'll naturally do them in order to reinforce your identity of being a person who just happens to use Japanese. So if you identify yourself as a language learner of Japanese, you're putting yourself in a position where your subconscious mind will think, well, I'm not actually a speaker of this language, so messing up grammar or pronunciation or literally anything is okay because I shouldn't be expected to be perfect anyway. If you identify yourself as a user of Japanese, you're essentially putting yourself on the same expectation level as other users of Japanese, aka Japanese people, and because making mistakes causes damage to this identity, your subconscious mind will do anything possible to avoid it, meaning that you're going to end up with better results than someone who doesn't feel any of that identity damage when making mistakes because they identify with being a learner who's already expected to make them in the first place. Now, I know this is all sort of abstract, and to be honest, identity isn't something that you can just change on the spot whenever you want, but if you plant the seed now and tell yourself, I'm just another person who uses Japanese in my life to do normal things in the same way that everyone in Japan does, you're eventually going to start subconsciously holding yourself to a higher standard. So in the past year that I've been gone from YouTube, I actually moved to Japan, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that having the identity of just another person who uses Japanese rather than Japanese learner has forced me to improve so much because I'm constantly holding myself to the same standard of Japanese as everyone else around me. And if I fail to hit that standard, yeah, it feels terrible and my ego takes a hit, but I come out better at Japanese than before. Also, some people might think all of this stuff is way too overkill and kind of unhealthy to a certain degree, but to be honest, you gotta be kind of crazy if your goal is perfection. So now that that's all out of the way, let's get into how to actually get a good accent in a more concrete way. So what even causes an accent in the first place? Well, accents are essentially just the product of lacking in perception. So I think most people would understand the idea that if you want to try to sound like a native speaker, you got to try to imitate them as best as you can. The problem is that if you can't actually tell what you're trying to imitate, then you're basically cooked from the beginning. If you think logically about why accents exist, it's because the sounds that are recognized in the brain aren't the same as the actual sounds spoken by native speakers. I talk in detail about this in the video I made about speaking, so watch that if you haven't yet. But the idea is that if you can't perceive a sound in the first place, you can't really judge yourself on whether or not you're saying it correctly or not. So most of the time you end up approximating your pronunciation to use similar sounds from your native language, and you aren't even aware that you're doing it. An example of this is like if a Japanese person tries to say thank you or any word with a th, they almost always end up saying thank you or making an S sound instead because it's the closest thing that there is to a th in Japanese and they literally can't perceive the difference that well. Consider this for the entire phonetic inventory of a language you're learning, and there's probably lots of sounds that you can't even perceive correctly, therefore trying to say them for yourself is just a non-starter. Like imagine you get told to sing a song, but you only have access to the lyrics of the song and you've never even heard how the song actually sounds before. Even if you have access to the lyrics of the song, which in this analogy means knowing the grammar, vocab, and having the technical skills, If you've never heard how the song actually sounds when performed by the person who made it, you have essentially zero chance of actually singing the song correctly. The key to eliminating an accent is to first build perception of the sounds, meaning you're able to hear the difference between Japanese sounds and English sounds, then applying those perceptions to your own speech. You essentially want to make Japanese sound the same way to you that it does to natives. So if you take anything away from this video, then have it be that the most important thing for building a good accent is having perception. No matter how much you attempt to practice physically producing sounds or studying phonetics with linguistic diagrams, unless you have the perception, you're not going to be able to reliably produce the correct sounds when speaking. Perception is the single most important thing to take into account when it comes to having a good accent, because without it, you're not even getting past step 1. Also, some people might say, well, I can perceive the sound, I just can't say it myself, like I physically can't make the sound. Most of the time, just by building perception, you're going to subconsciously start saying the correct thing because you don't just say something that you know is wrong. But sometimes physically making the sounds is the hard part, so in that situation you can go and just look at, okay, what is actually happening inside my mouth, and then try to practice and fix it. But even if just making the physical sound is the bottleneck, you still need perception in order to fix it. So you might be wondering, okay bro, cool, I get it, but how am I supposed to build perception of sounds if I can't hear the sounds in the first place? You guys probably already know what I'm gonna say. It's just listening, and more listening, and more listening, and listening again, and maybe just a little bit more listening. Oh, and you probably want to do listening too. If you feed your brain enough spoken Japanese, it's going to quickly pick up on the sounds of Japanese and pattern recognize its way to building a really strong conceptual framework of how Japanese sounds work and how they're different to the sounds of English or whatever your native language is. Learning to speak a language with a good accent is a matter of mimicking what you've heard from native speakers, and if you don't spend an ungodly amount of time taking in native speech, you can't expect to sound similar to them. Output ability is mostly a product of the quality and quantity of your input. Yeah, speaking well requires physically moving your mouth and learning how to phrase things well, but the bulk of your ability is going to come from unconscious knowledge that you internalized when listening to natives speak Japanese. It's essentially that whatever you put in is similar to what's going to come out. For this reason, it's really important that you listen to the right things. If you want to sound Japanese, you need to be inputting with a lot of natural speech, stuff that you'd find in YouTube videos or in podcasts where people are just talking normally, including all of the impurities and fillers in their speech. I think most immersion learners probably watch a lot of anime to learn Japanese, which, don't get me wrong, is a great resource in general for language exposure and building comfortability with Japanese as a language, but it's also not super representative of how people actually speak, so you don't want it to be the main source of your immersion if your goal is output maxing. It's also really important that you spend a lot of time immersing in content that sounds similar to how you want to portray yourself. Like, if you're learning Kansai Ben, don't spend the majority of your time immersing in standard Japanese from Tokyo. And if you're a young guy in your 20s trying to speak similarly to how young Japanese men speak, then spend most of your time getting input from young Japanese men. Remember that what you put in is what comes out, so you really want to tailor your input to your goals as much as possible. This probably sounds fairly logical to most people, and you're probably thinking, yeah, duh. But I also want to emphasize something that might sound kind of controversial, which is that reading can and will harm your accent. I've mentioned this in previous videos slightly, and to be honest, I've sort of tiptoed around the topic as to not make it sound like people who read are just doomed. But I genuinely think reading is actively harmful to your accent if your perception and comfortability with Japanese sounds isn't at a really strong level. If you look at second language speakers in almost any language, there is a really noticeable trend of people who learned mostly through audio ending up sounding pretty good, and people who learned mostly from text developing a really strong accent. This makes sense if you think about the logic behind it, which is that when you read, you're reinforcing the perception of sounds that you currently have by hearing them in your head. It's not hard to imagine that someone who hasn't learned how Japanese actually sounds could theoretically learn to read and understand Japanese flawlessly, but still end up sounding like, "Itsumo yori joukigen ni natta kanojo wa fudan yori jibun jishin no koto o hanashitagatta. Boku wa hito no hanashi o kiite iru hou ga shaberu koto yori mo suki na no de sugo ga yokatta." Like, if that was your perception of how Japanese sounds and you spent hundreds or thousands of hours reading books like that, then obviously all you've done is reinforce that Japanese sounds like that to yourself. Now obviously that's a really extreme example and most people don't sound nearly that bad, but even if they're just minor mistakes, you're still reinforcing them by reading. When you learn mostly through text, you're spending hundreds or even thousands of hours internalizing your own pronunciation mistakes because that little voice in your head isn't pronouncing them right. which is why if you really care a lot about sounding similar to a native speaker, you should actively avoid learning through written materials until you're at a spot where you feel really confident in your ability to know that your perception is built up to a strong level, which honestly can take a really long time, even years if you want to be extreme. So to be honest, it's not really clear when or to what extent reading is going to start becoming a really big problem, so take this advice with a grain of salt, but remember that your output is a product of your input, meaning that if you don't already have a good perception, you're just deepening your own mistakes. If I had to put a number on it, I'd say that if you're gonna read, but you really care a lot about having a good accent, try to have something like a 9-to-1 ratio of listening to reading. Now I know there's probably a ton of people that have already left a comment being like, bro, I get what you're saying, but like, I've already read 100 books, so it's kind of too late. Honestly, in this situation, my advice would essentially be the same, just start listening way more than you read by a ratio of like 9-to-1, but because you've already unconsciously solidified a lot of your mistakes, you're probably going to need to be more intentional with trying to fix them, which is going to involve studying pronunciation rules in a more targeted way, which I'll talk about later in the video. So basically, just to summarize everything I just said, A, you want to build perception by mass listening and constantly paying attention to sounds. B, you want to listen to natural off-the-cuff spoken Japanese, and you want it to be by people who speak similarly to how you want to speak. And then C, you want your foundation to be built upon listening ability, not reading. Also, something that might be good if you want to try it is shadowing. Shadowing is just when you take a piece of native audio and then you play it while saying it at the same time, and then you try to check for differences between your own speech and the native speech.
構成話すると実はすごい複雑で、ソリータさんがさっき冒頭言ってたすごく複雑な曲だなって言ってたのはこういう意味なのよ。それをアレンジでどう成立させるかっていうのを、あとまあアレンジと構成を どの組み合わせがこの1234っていう曲のメロディーの構成をどういう風にどのタイミングつなげれば一番綺麗かっていうのをすごい試行錯誤して、それ流れが決まった時にどうアレンジするかっていうのをまあやっていったってできたのがこの怪獣。
Okay, so I have the audio I recorded here, and I have the video I was shadowing here. And so if we listen to my audio,
どの組み合わせがこの1234っていう曲のメロディーの構成を
something I noticed is that my pronunciation of the word melody is a little bit wrong.
いう曲のメロディーの構成を
So I say melody and he says
構成をどの組み合わせがこの1234っていう曲のメロディーの構成を
melody. So the intonation's a little bit off here.
4っていう曲のメロディーの構成を
melody. So I say it flat and he actually accents the me. And so mine is a little bit different than his, and so I can figure out, oh, I made a mistake here. And that's sort of the basis of shadowing. It's just a really easy way to compare your own speech to the same exact thing being said by a native. If you're still pretty new to outputting and you physically can't move your mouth that fast, then I would recommend starting with podcasts that are made for learners. They usually talk pretty slowly and clearly, so you should be able to start picking up on differences between their pronunciation and yours. So I've never really done shadowing a ton, and I know a lot of people that have and had good results with it, and I'm also experimenting with it myself, but you definitely don't need to do shadowing. It's definitely an optional thing. I would recommend at least trying it, but if you feel like you don't vibe with it, then it's fine not to do it. Okay, so next I want to talk about pitch accent. So pitch accent is this thing in Japanese where words are accented differently depending on what part of a word gets pronounced high or low, and lots of words have the same kana but are distinguished by different pitch accents. The most famous examples include words like bridge and chopsticks being pronounced with the same kana, but they have different pitch patterns.
Hashi.
The other one that's always talked about is rain and candy.
Ame.
There are a lot of word pairs that are distinguished only by pitch accent, and I'll put a bunch of them on the screen. This is similar to stress accent in English, where if you stress the wrong part of a word, it will sound strange or even mean something completely different, like in the case of dessert and desert, or present and present. Like if I said, tomorrow I'm taking a trip to Japan, it sounds strange because the words are stressed wrong. So in English, there's stress accent, and it means that one part of the word is pronounced longer and louder than the rest. But in Japanese, the length or loudness doesn't really change, just the tone in which you say it. Non-native speakers of Japanese make pitch mistakes constantly, mostly because I don't even think that they were even told it exists. If you don't already speak a tonal language or aren't musically trained, you most likely can't perceive pitch accent very well, which was the case for me when I started learning Japanese. Despite what people on Reddit will tell you, pitch accent's absolutely essential to understand decently well if you want to have a native-sounding accent in Japanese. You don't necessarily have to study the rules to pitch accent and memorize every little detail, but at the very least, you need to be able to tell where the accent is in a word and pay attention to it when listening to Japanese so that you'll become able to replicate it in your own speech. Like I said previously, the more solidified your spoken Japanese and your perception already is, the harder it's going to be to change unconsciously through sheer listening. So if you're coming from the perspective of trying to fix an accent that you've already been speaking with for a long time, studying the actual rules is going to become more important. I'm going to go over a lot of the rules in a second, but first I want to talk about why people claim not to study pitch accent. In the online Japanese learning community, honestly, there's like so many people who are just against the idea of studying pitch accent in its entirety. A lot of people claim that worrying about pitch accent is pointless and a waste of time, and a lot of people claim that it's not even important for a good accent in the first place, which to be honest is just kind of cope. People will say things like, well, depending on the dialect of Japanese, pitch accent changes, so it doesn't even matter if you mess it up. Which honestly makes like absolutely zero sense. Like, imagine a guy who speaks mostly with an American accent and then just randomly switches to words in Australian or British or an Indian accent like half the time. Like, just because kino is pronounced as kino in Kansai Ben doesn't mean that if you say it like that when you're trying to speak standard Japanese that it isn't a mistake or that it doesn't sound strange, especially if you're doing this for most words. Anyways, I digress. My point is that speaking with correct pitch accent is incredibly important for trying to minimize your accent. Now, to be honest, pitch accent is pretty complicated and there's a lot of difficult parts to it, but if you listen to a lot of Japanese, you're going to pick up most of it subconsciously. That is, if you've already learned how to perceive it. You don't have to speak with literally perfect pitch accent to have a good accent, and it's one of the things that I mess up the most in Japanese still. Like, you might have seen this video I made over 2 years ago where I speak Japanese. Honestly, I haven't rewatched this video in a long time because I know it has a bunch of pitch accent mistakes that I'm going to cringe at myself for. But if you take your pitch accent accuracy from like 40 or 50% all the way up to like 90, the difference between how good your accent is and the compliments that people will give you on it are night and day. Like, I noticed that the thing people compliment most about my Japanese is my intonation, which is just what they call pitch accent in Japanese. But it makes sense that when you speak with pretty good pitch accents, Japanese people really notice it, because most foreigners just have zero idea that it even exists in the first place. Despite this, there's still unfortunately a ton of people in the community who are against studying pitch accent. But the ironic thing is that I've never met a single person who actually got pretty good at pitch accent and then said it was a waste of time. Now, I know I just started a war with all the pitch accent haters, but to be fair, if trying to have a good accent doesn't align with your goals for learning Japanese in the first place, then studying pitch accent could very well just be a waste of time for you personally. You can mess up pitch accent constantly and still be super fluent in Japanese and have absolutely no problems in Japan. Countless people have done it, which is why a lot of people come to the conclusion that it's pointless and don't bother to learn it in the first place. This is a fair argument if you're someone who doesn't care much about having an accent, but for the small percentage of people who are like me and have identity issues, you need to be aware of pitch changes in Japanese. Pitch accent isn't as difficult as people make it seem, and honestly, I feel like pitch accent study gets way more hate than it deserves. And honestly, if it weren't for people like Dogen on YouTube teaching it, then most learners probably still wouldn't even know that it exists. So right now you're probably thinking, okay bro, I get it, pitch accent's important and all, but like, how do you actually learn it? Well, I already discussed how important listening is, and for some people, especially people who haven't already built their entire foundation with reading, listening alone is good enough to get you a really good sounding accent because you subconsciously start to pick up on the nuances in the sound when doing tons of listening. Now, this isn't the case for everyone, and honestly, even if you build your foundation with listening, you probably still can't pick up on pitch accent perfectly, which is why I'd recommend training yourself to do it by using what's called minimal pairs testing. So minimal pairs testing is basically just engaging in a feedback loop where you have two sounds and only one thing about them is different, and then you just keep grading yourself on that. If you want to do this with pitch accent, and I recommend that you do, there's this website that's really popular in the community called Kotsu.io, and if you spend 10 to 15 minutes every day doing the pitch accent minimal pairs test until you can get 100% on it, you're going to start noticing pitch accent in real Japanese really quickly.
我が区、起源、課長、栄、多分、九死、長治、高校、無害。
When I started doing this, I probably had around a 50% pass rate in hearing pitch, but after doing this test every day for a few weeks and intentionally trying to hear pitch accent when I was listening to Japanese, I pretty quickly got the hang of it, and I couldn't believe that I was essentially tone deaf before then. It's not going to come instantly, and it might take you even a month or two to really get the hang of it, but if you keep doing the minimal pairs test and you keep listening to lots of Japanese, you will pick it up, and it will be crystal clear to you. When you get to the point where you can reliably hear pitch accent well, then you've done most of the work already, and everything else I'm going to explain here is sort of optional or supplemental if you plan on being more intentional with it. So this is the part of the video where I'm going to start going into actual pronunciation rules and some good tips that you might want to know. So honestly, you don't have to memorize everything I'm going to say here, and I wouldn't even recommend that you try to, but I think just having basic knowledge about this stuff or keeping it in the back of your mind when you're listening to actual Japanese is going to help you a ton. The more solidified your mistakes are, the more important it is to be intentional with trying to apply these to your speech. The end goal is to make this stuff as subconscious as possible, but if you've already been speaking Japanese with a really strong accent and have a lot of bad bad habits, it's probably not realistic to expect that most of your issues are going to be solved that way. So now I'm going to go over the basic pitch accent patterns of Japanese. These are for standard Tokyo Japanese, and other dialects are going to be different, so if you're studying Kansai-ben or something, then you can honestly just skip this section. So I'm going to be referencing the linguistic term mora in this section, but you can basically just think of it as a measurement of a unit of time when it comes to producing Japanese. The simplest way to think about it is that one mora is one kana letter, and while it's not technically that simple, for the sake of what I'm talking about here, it's probably fine to think of it that way. Be careful though, because when you attach small kana letters and it changes the sound, something like kya, that's considered one mora, not two. Also, if you add a small tsu into a word like gakko, then that also counts as one mora. So there are 4 basic patterns that you're going to want to know, and I'm going to go over them here. So first is the heiban pattern, and it essentially just means flat board, which starts low, rises on the second mora, and stays high until the end of the word. You can essentially think of this as the flat pattern, and some examples are Amerika, Shirokuma, and Asobu. The next one is called atamadaka, meaning head high, and the pitch drop is always after the first mora and stays low for the remainder of the word. Some examples include neko, jinsei, and chugoku. The next one is called nakadaka, and words with this pattern have a pitch drop somewhere in the middle of the word. Some examples are taberu, tatemono, and nihon. The last is called odaka, and words with this pattern in isolation are exactly the same as heiban, meaning that they start low and stay high until the end of the word. They're essentially flat, but the difference is that at the end of the word, if there's a particle, the particle is going to attach low. Some examples include kotoba ga, atama ga, and hashi ga. So if you're paying close attention, then you might have noticed that there are a few things consistent about all of these patterns, and that's because there are actually some rules that bind the way pitch works in standard Japanese. These don't apply in every dialect, so be careful. The first is that the first and the second mora of a word are always without fail a different pitch. Words cannot start with too high mora or too low mora in standard Japanese. The second is that once a pitch falls one time, it doesn't come back up again within the same word. If you spend a few hundred hours listening and keep yourself really honed in on pitch accent, these patterns and the rules that bind them will start to come really naturally to you, even if you don't decide to consciously study them very much. So I want to quickly go over some of the more important pitch rules that you can memorize and that are pretty applicable right away. And while I'm at it, I'll mention the most common mistakes that people make too. Obviously, these aren't anywhere near all the rules, but memorizing every single rule isn't very practical in the first place, so here are just some easier / more common ones that are important. Also, I know that not everyone who watches my videos is a native English speaker, but because the video is in English and for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to reference mistakes that English natives often make, so what I say might not always apply to you depending on what languages you already speak. So the first thing I want to talk about is verbs and how there's only 2 ways that you can pronounce them. The first is flat, and the second is with the drop after the second to last mora. Think about words like hashiru, taberu, kaku. The accent's always in the same spot. Native English speakers actually have a pretty easy time getting the accent right on these words because the accent's similar to how we would say these words if they were imported into English. The other pattern that verbs come in is heiban, meaning that they're just pronounced flat. Words like iku, kiku, and musubu use this pattern. Native English speakers often really struggle with this pattern because of the natural inclination to add stress to everything, and because they're so used to doing it with the other verbs that are accented in the middle of the word, it's probably the single most common pitch mistake that learners make. Saying something like Tokyo ni iku is wrong. The correct way to say this would be Tokyo ni iku. I also should mention that this rule applies to conjugations of verbs too, so flat verbs will stay flat when conjugated, and ones that have a drop will keep the drop. Although the drop position can change, taberu doesn't turn into tabeta, it turns into tabeta. The next really common rule that you want to learn is that almost all 4 mora nouns are pronounced heiban. If you see a word with 2 kanji and 4 mora, something like gakko, kenko, or kaigan, it's most likely pronounced flat. There are a lot of exceptions to this, but it's easier just to memorize this as a blanket rule and take note of the exceptions as they come up. Again, because of how English works, there's a really strong inclination to say something like gakko or kenko, and learning to recognize that these are actually pronounced flat will instantly make your accent better. But you need to be careful though, because when you turn nouns like this into compound words, the accent does shift to drop after the first mora of the second word. So for example, if you take the word I just said, kaigan, and you add higashi before it, it doesn't stay flat, it actually becomes higashi kaigan. You should really be aware of this because there's a lot of words that mostly come up in compounds, but the actual word in isolation is actually said differently. Like I used to constantly make the mistake of saying jimaku as jimaku, because when you say eigo jimaku or nihongo jimaku, it actually drops after ji. So a word like gakko would be pronounced flat in isolation, but if it's part of a compound such as koto gakko, then it will be pronounced with the drop after the first mora. Compound words themselves are pretty easy because it's really similar to how we would stress it in English, but you should be careful that you don't accidentally say a word with the wrong pitch accent because you usually hear it in a compound, but by itself it's actually pronounced flat. Those are the two major rules I'd recommend keeping note of the most, and the rest I'm going to just go through pretty quickly. So if you have a word that has an accent drop such as kagaku and you add teki to the end, you'll be left with kagaku-teki. Adding teki to the end of any word overrides the original pitch accent and turns it heiban. Prefectures and cities have their accent changed to drop before the second to last mora when adding ken or shi to the end of a word. Saitama is pronounced atamadaka in isolation, but it becomes Saitama-ken and Saitama-shi when the classifier is added. A cool distinction that I think is interesting is the pitch for Akita being atamadaka, but turning nakadaka for Akita-ken, as in Akita Prefecture, and turning heiban for Akita-ken, as in Akita breed of dog. I should also note that basically all prefectures with 2 or 3 mora use the atamadaka pattern when pronounced in isolation. Aichi, Tochigi, Chiba, Kochi. Keeping with the pitch of place names, in standard Japanese, place names almost always are pronounced in one of 2 ways, the first being flat with the heiban pattern, such as Tokyo, Osaka, Ueno, and the other with the drop being before the second to last mora, as in Kanazawa or Nakameguro. When we say these Japanese place names in English, we almost always stress the words differently, so be careful not to say Osaka, Kanazawa, Ueno. The exception to this rule is when a place name only has 2 mora, such as Chiba or Mie. And like I mentioned a second ago, they almost are all atamadaka. Similarly to the rule with prefectures, when saying what nationality you are by adding jin to the end of a country, the accent always shifts to drop after the country name regardless of what the original accent of the country was, such as Chugoku being pronounced as Chugokujin, and America being pronounced as Amerikajin. The one notable exception to this rule is Nihonjin, where the accent drops after ji, although in other dialects you often hear Nihonjin. Something similar happens when adding go to the end of a country to designate its language. Regardless of the accent of the original word, if you add go to the end of the word, it will become heiban. Nihon turns into Nihongo. Chugoku turns into Chugokugo, etc. So saying something like Chugokugo would be wrong. Next is that pretty much all body parts are pronounced with the Odaka pattern. Udega, atamaga. So next there's a rule where Odaka words and some Nakadaka words turn heiban when the no particle is attached to the end. So words like yama, kawa, or any body part words usually have the particle drop after the word, but if it's no, then the particle will be said flat most of the time. Yama no, kawa no, mune no. This is actually really good to remember for when an Odaka word has no naka come after it, in which the pitch is going to stay flat until after na. Mune no naka, kawa no naka. I also said this applies to Nakadaka words too, but it's even more inconsistent and I wouldn't try to worry about it too much, but basically this can just happen when a Nakadaka word ends in n or a double vowel. Really common examples that you should be aware of though is Nihon no and Kino no. Again, the rules for this are kind of complicated and some native speakers even have different opinions on what sounds correct or not, so I don't think it's worth trying to remember this consciously and apply it while you're trying to talk, but you should at least be aware that this rule exists. If you have an onomatopoeia word like kira kira, it's pronounced flat in isolation, but when modifying a verb, it becomes atamadaka.
パーティーにキラキラの服を着ていく。空の星がキラキラ光る。
Another one is that foreign loanwords tend to be atamadaka a lot of the time, and especially 2 or 3 mora loanwords are almost always atamadaka. Some examples are like misu, mask, tomato, radio. Okay, so next I want to go over some basic pronunciation shift rules. Again, same for the pitch accent rules. These are mostly helpful for people who need to consciously try and fix an already strong accent. So if you build your foundation on listening and already have a pretty strong ear, you probably already internalized these already. You don't really need to memorize these, but keep them in the back of your mind for when you're listening and you'll start to pick up on them pretty quickly. So I think if you've spent even a little bit of time listening to natural Japanese, you've probably already acquired this subconsciously and are saying it right, but I'll mention it anyway just in case, which is that u and i, when said between voiceless consonants, actually get devoiced. In Japanese, this is called museika. The easiest way to explain this is with dakten, so imagine the difference between ka and ga, or ta and da. They're actually the same exact sound in the mouth physically, just that one uses the vocal cords and the other doesn't. The use of vocal cords here is what actually matters though. When you have an i or an u between 2 consonants that don't use the vocal cords, such as sh or k, the i or the u gets almost deleted. This is why despite the kana for this word being read as shi, ke, n, the pronunciation is actually shiken. Notice how in this word jiken, this devoicing doesn't happen because ji already has dakten and is pronounced with the vocal cords, so i doesn't get devoiced. Be careful with this because Dakuten doesn't explicitly dictate this rule. It's just the easiest way to explain it to non-linguistics people. So kana like mi, ri, ni are still sounds that use the vocal cords despite having no Dakuten, so no devoicing will happen. Next is short, but a lot of people overthink and really struggle with the Japanese R sound, but it's really not that complicated at all. And if you already speak English, then you probably use this same sound all the time. The Japanese R is called a tap, and it's literally the same sound that we make when saying words like ladder or butter in English. We don't actually say ladder or butter. We just tap our tongue on the roof of our mouth slightly. The Japanese R is this exact sound. Rarirurero. So if you're someone who struggles with the Japanese R sound, just say the word butter or ladder and replicate that exact sound when you speak Japanese. So next there's a lot of changes that involve the sound n, and to be honest, a lot of them are really complicated and would require me to explain a ton of linguistic stuff that make no sense to 99% of the people watching this, so I'll just go over it as simply as I can. So first, when you have an n sound that precedes a consonant that uses your lips like b, or p, words like junbi or sampo, the n doesn't actually get pronounced as its usual kana reading. Instead, it actually assimilates into an m-like sound. Junbi is not junbi, it's jumbi, junbi. Same with sampo, it's not sanpo, it's sampo, sampo. This sort of thing also happens when n precedes a k or a g sound, in which n turns into a nasal sound similar to the word sing in English. The word manga isn't ma-nga, it's ma-nga. Honestly, this one's pretty intuitive, and English basically has the same thing in words like long or hunger, so you probably don't need to worry about this one too much. So of the n rules, I saved the most important one for last. So when n goes before any vowel, the n basically just gets deleted and the vowel gets nasalized and extended. Look at the word gain. The kana is gen-in, but this word isn't pronounced like that at all. The n gets deleted and the get basically just extends and nasalizes. So rather than gen-in, you get gain. There's a bunch of really common words in which this happens, such as tein-san or zain. I remember when I was still kind of new to Japanese and I heard the word main densha, and I was like, what? Ma-in densha? What is that? It was really just man-in densha. But because of the sound shift, I had no clue what was actually being said. The other ones are sort of intuitive, but this one you might have to consciously think about. So last, I just want to talk a little bit about vowels. So trying to explain the exact differences between the Japanese vowels and the English vowels would take a long time, and I'd need a lot of linguistic lingo, and it would take forever. So instead, I'm just going to leave you with a little bit of a helpful reference point for pronouncing vowels. So what we think of as vowels in English, a lot of the time are actually two vowels. Like O and A in English are actually technically two different vowels. Japanese vowels don't combine with other vowels like in English, so they stay consistent throughout the whole mora. So one thing about English vowels is that lip rounding is really common. When you say oo, you're rounding your lips, but when you say u in Japanese, you don't round your lips at all. The only vowel in Japanese that requires lip rounding is o, and even then the rounding isn't as strong as the English o, which is actually technically two vowels. If the concept of lip rounding is a little bit hard to grasp, then just imagine that the Japanese u sound comes straight from the throat and doesn't get modified by the front of your mouth. The Japanese I and the English I are basically the same sound. Just be careful that when you're speaking Japanese, you don't extend the vowel on accident and say I, like in English. The Japanese e is technically in English, but it's almost always paired with a different vowel, but I don't think it should be too hard to pick up. Okay, so that's like the bare minimum basics about vowels if you want to know them. Again, trying to memorize all of this stuff and then apply it while you're speaking Japanese in real time is probably pretty impractical. But if you just make yourself aware that these rules exist and then you listen to a lot of Japanese, it's gonna come to you pretty naturally. So anyways, congratulations, you got to the end of my long rant about accent rules. So I made this video for people who genuinely care about having a really good accent and are willing to go kind of extreme to get it. But not everything I said here would necessarily be my advice for the average person learning Japanese. Again, the degree to which you want to take all of this stuff sort of just depends on your goals, so as always, take what I say with a grain of salt and apply whatever principles you like wherever you think they'll help you. So I guess I gotta apologize for making everyone think I died for an entire year. I'm not really gonna go into too much detail, but I had a lot of stuff going on and I moved to Japan and, you know, things happen. I had this awesome VTuber model made for me, and so I think I want to start doing some live streams too. Honestly, I'm in love with this model, and I think the artist did a great job, so please go follow her on Twitter. Anyways, hopefully I don't disappear for an entire year again, but you never know. Mite kurete arigatou gozaimasu. Sayonara minasan.